The war had no real beginning anymore. No one alive could remember the first shot, the first betrayal, the first world that burned. It had simply always been a grinding, galaxy-spanning slaughter that swallowed fleets the way a black hole swallows light. Quietly, completely, without apology. Commander Kothful of the Vreth Dominion stood at the observation deck of Battle Station Orin 7 and watched another convoy of wounded ships limp through the docking rings. Twisted metal, shattered viewports, crews that stumbled off their vessels with the hollow eyes of those who had seen things that don't wash off. She had seen it 1,000 times. It never got easier. She pressed her four-fingered hand against the cold viewport and exhaled slowly. "Another victory," said a voice behind her, dry as dust, thick with sarcasm. She didn't turn around. 42 ships lost, 17,000 dead. Yes, glorious. Admiral Vren moved to stand beside her, his silver-scaled hide dull under the station's pale light. He was old, ancient by Vreth standards, and he carried the war on his spine like a physical weight. "You didn't come to watch the docking, Kothful. What is it?" She hesitated. Then she pulled out her datapad and handed it to him. "I've been doing routine sector mapping for the new offensive corridor. I found something strange." Vren studied the star chart. Near the edge of the Orion spur, far from the main fronts but close enough to matter, sat a small blue-green world. Unremarkable in size, unremarkable in position. But around it, for a radius of nearly 30 light-years, there was nothing. No wreckage, no contested systems, no Cellorian probes, no Vreth expansion flags, just empty, untouched space, as if the war itself had decided to walk around it. "Humans," Vren said. His voice dropped half a register. "You know them." "I know of them." He handed the datapad back slowly, like it had become heavier. "Everyone does. They sent a message to the Conclave 47 years ago. Polite, formal. They said they were aware of the conflict and had chosen not to participate at this time." He emphasized the last 3 words with something that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite fear. "No one has heard from them since." Kothful frowned. "And no one followed up, no one pressed them, not us, not the Cellorians." Vren was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a damaged cruiser scraped against the docking clamp with a sound like a dying animal. "There was a Cellorian raid," he said finally, "early in the silence. They hit a human colony, small world, maybe 2 million inhabitants." "What happened?" Vren looked at her steadily. "The raiding fleet disappeared, every ship, every crew, no debris, no distress call, nothing." He paused. "The Cellorians classified it as a navigation accident. Everyone agreed to believe that." He turned and walked toward the exit. "Leave the humans alone, Kothful. Whatever they're doing in that silence, let them do it." He left. She stood there alone, staring at that small, untouched circle on the star chart. "At this time." The words itched at the back of her mind like a splinter she couldn't reach. 47 years of silence. A fleet that vanished without a trace. A war that somehow, instinctively, nobody had dared to carry to their doorstep. She zoomed in on Earth on the holographic display. It was a beautiful world, really. Blues and greens and swirling whites. Peaceful looking in the way that something deep and still and very, very patient looks peaceful. Not sleeping, she thought. Something about it didn't feel like sleep at all. She thought about the message again. At this time. Not "we refuse," not "we are neutral," not even "leave us alone." Just a calm, quiet, almost casual statement. "We know, we see you. We are choosing to wait." Kothful had grown up in the war. Had been commissioned at 19, had fought in 6 major campaigns, had earned 3 decorations she never wore because they felt obscene. She knew every major player in this conflict. She knew what fear looked like, what arrogance looked like, what desperation looked like. She had never, in her entire career, encountered something that looked like patience. She saved the star chart to her personal drive and filed it under a label she almost never used. Investigate further. Outside, the stars burned as they always did, cold and indifferent and ancient. And somewhere at the edge of the Orion spur something waited, quietly, without urgency, without fear. as if it already knew exactly how this would all turn out and simply hadn't decided yet whether to tell anyone. Kothful stared at the little blue-green world for a long time. Then she started reading. The conclave's public archives were a masterpiece of organized forgetting. Kothful learned this quickly. The records were vast, centuries deep, cross-referenced across 100 species and 1,000 conflicts, but they had a peculiar quality. The things that should have been significant kept appearing in footnotes, buried, misfiled, labeled with the bureaucratic equivalent of nothing to see here. She spent 3 days in the Orange 7 data library before she found the first real thread. Humanity's early contact history with the conclave was, to put it simply, overwhelming. They had arrived on the galactic stage about 200 years ago, loud, curious, endlessly enthusiastic. Their diplomatic missions were staffed by people who had clearly read everything about a species before meeting them, and then asked follow-up questions nobody else thought to ask. Their traders showed up with goods that nobody had thought to commodify, art forms, musical structures, mathematical frameworks presented as cultural exchanges. Their explorers went places the conclave had flagged as too dangerous and came back with maps and samples, and a cheerful disregard for their own mortality that other species found either inspiring or deeply unsettling. For the first century of contact, humanity had been everywhere. Then came the war, and slowly, not all at once but steadily, they began to pull back, recalled ambassadors, reduced trade routes. Their conclave seat went from active participation to observation to, eventually, empty. And then the Torvin colony. Kothful almost missed it. It was listed in a subsection of a Silurian military report under the heading Navigational Casualties, Outer Rim Operations. She almost scrolled past it. Something, instinct, or the memory of Vren's careful voice made her stop. She read it twice, then a third time. A Silurian strike fleet, 43 vessels, dispatched to raid the human colony world of Torvin IV. Standard operation, resource extraction, population displacement, a message to the wider sector about Silurian reach. The fleet entered the system, and then the log simply stopped. The last automated telemetry showed all 43 ships in standard attack formation, descending toward the colony. Then nothing. The follow-up investigation report was 3 sentences long. Fleet lost to suspected navigational anomaly. Area flagged for avoidance. Case closed. 3 sentences for 43 ships. Kothful leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. She dug deeper. Underneath the official report, buried in an archived complaint from a junior Silurian analyst who had clearly been furious and clearly been ignored, was a fragment of data, a sensor ghost. Something had been picked up by a passing conclave survey drone 6 hours after the fleet's disappearance. Not wreckage, not radiation bloom, not the signature of any known weapon. Just a faint energy pattern that the drone's computer had failed to classify, and therefore had labeled almost apologetically, unknown, no match in database. She copied it, sent it to a physicist she trusted at the Conclave Science Division, wrote in the message, "What does this look like to you? Don't file a report, just tell me." The response came 8 hours later. It was 4 words long. "Where did you get this?" She was still staring at that message when the archivist found her, an old Ythran with milky eyes and ink-stained fingers, who had worked in these archives for longer than the current phase of the war had lasted. He glanced at her screen, saw the energy signature, and went very still. "You're looking into the humans," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." He glanced left and right with the practiced caution of someone who had spent decades around dangerous information. Then he sat down across from her and lowered his voice. "We filed it under navigational anomaly," he said. "We filed everything under navigational anomaly. 3 separate incidents, different years, different circumstances, all the same signature." He tapped her screen gently. No one wanted to ask what really happened, because asking meant acknowledging what the answer probably was. Kothful looked at him steadily. "Which was?" The old archivist folded his hands on the table. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had been quietly carrying a secret that was too heavy to keep and too dangerous to put down. That whatever the humans built in their silence, he said softly, we have never seen anything like it, and they used it once 47 years ago to send a message no one was willing to officially receive. He stood slowly, joints cracking. Leave it alone, Commander. The war will end someday. Empires rise and fall, but something that can make 43 warships disappear without a single piece of debris. He pushed his chair in. That doesn't go away. That waits. He walked out. Kothful sat alone in the archive, surrounded by centuries of recorded history, and felt, for the first time in her military career, genuinely, deeply, and profoundly small. War Marshal Drevas of the Silurian Collective had not survived 40 years of command by being sentimental. He had burned worlds. He had broken treaties. He had once ordered the execution of his own fleet admiral mid-battle because the man had hesitated at a critical moment. And hesitation, Drevas believed with his entire being, was the most expensive thing in the universe. He had built his reputation on a single, brutal principle. Everything is a resource, and every resource can be leveraged. So when his strategic analysts flagged a 30-light-year corridor near the Orion Spur that had never been contested, never been probed, never been even skimmed by either side in the war, Drevas didn't feel the unease that seemed to grip everyone else. He felt opportunity. The humans, he said, studying the sector map with his long, pale fingers laced behind his back. Still silent. Yes, Marshal, no transmissions in 47 years, no fleet movements, no diplomatic contact. Cowardice, he said flatly, or irrelevance. He turned to his intelligence chief, a thin, nervous creature named Pell who always looked like he was bracing for bad news. I want a scouting fleet dispatched. Observation only. Count their ships, map their infrastructure, assess their industrial capacity. I want to know if they're worth recruiting or worth taking. Pell opened his mouth, closed it, and then said carefully, Marshal, there's a precedent. I know about the Torvin incident, Drevas said, his voice cutting like cold wire. A navigational anomaly. It's in the report. Yes, sir, of course. Pell did not look convinced. A full scouting fleet. 12 ships, fast movers. Stay outside weapons range, whatever that range might be. Observe and return. 12 ships departed 3 days later. Fast, modern, well-crewed. The best scouts in the Silurian fleet. They were due back in 18 days. On day 20, Drevas was still waiting. On day 23, 10 ships returned. The other 2 did not, and no one who came back seemed eager to discuss them. The crews were physically unharmed. Medically, they were perfect. But they sat in debrief sessions and stared at the walls and gave answers that were technically complete but somehow said almost nothing. We observed. We assessed. We returned. When pressed on the missing ships, they said they had suffered mechanical failure. All of them. The exact same answer, word for word, as if rehearsed, or as if the true answer was something their minds had quietly decided not to produce. The sensor logs had been wiped, not corrupted, not damaged, manually wiped from the inside by the crews themselves at some point during the return journey. Drevas sat alone with the debrief reports for a long time. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had looked into the face of death so many times that it had become almost familiar, a neighbor he didn't like but had grown used to. This was different. This felt like looking through a window into a room that should have been empty and seeing something looking back. He thought about Torvin IV. He had read the real report, not the sanitized 3-sentence version, but the full internal Silurian military analysis that existed in exactly one encrypted archive. 43 ships, no debris, no radiation, no bodies, just an energy signature that their best scientists had spent a decade trying to classify and eventually gave up on, labeling it extant but undefined. Extant but undefined for a weapon. He thought about what it would mean to have a weapon so precise, so complete, that it left no evidence. Not just no survivors, no evidence. Not even the satisfaction of wreckage. Just absence. as if the ships had been removed from reality with the casual efficiency of someone clearing a table. He thought about the message humanity had sent 47 years ago. We have chosen not to participate at this time. At this time, he picked up the order he had half-drafted to send a second, larger fleet. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he fed it into the document shredder beside his desk and watched it disappear. He pulled up the sector map and stared at that quiet, untouched circle of space. All around it, the war raged and burned and consumed. And in the middle of it all, that small blue-green world sat in its silence like a stone at the bottom of a river, unmoved, unbothered, worn smooth by time and patience. Drevos was not a man who frightened easily. But he was a man who recognized, when he saw it, the shape of something that had been waiting for a very long time. Something that had counted every ship he'd ever launched, every world he'd ever burned, every move he'd ever made. He closed the map. He didn't open it again for a long time. The ship appeared in conclave neutral space on a Tuesday. No one saw it coming. Not because it was cloaked, it wasn't. Not because it was fast, it was actually traveling at a rather leisurely pace, as if it had all the time in the universe. No one saw it coming simply because it emerged from a vector that led back through 30 light-years of empty, unmonitored human space, and by the time it registered on any scanner, it was already inside the neutral zone, broadcasting a clean diplomatic identification code. The code was 47 years old, still perfectly formatted, still valid. Conclave Traffic Control spent 11 minutes in complete silence before anyone managed to compose a response. The ship was mid-sized, roughly equivalent to a Vreth diplomatic cruiser. Its design was clean and functional without being aggressive, though those who studied it closely noted that it had no obvious weapon ports, which either meant it was unarmed or that its weapons were hidden well enough to be invisible, and both possibilities were unsettling in entirely different ways. It carried one passenger. Her name was Elena Vasquez, human, female by human biological classification. Somewhere between 40 and 60 years old, human ages were difficult to estimate, and she had a quality that made her seem simultaneously young and ageless. She walked off her ship into the docking bay of Conclave Station Meridian with a small bag, a calm expression, and absolutely no security escort. She was greeted by a flustered Conclave protocol officer named Jeseth, who had been woken up at 4 in the morning station time and was operating on minimal sleep and maximum anxiety. Vasquez shook his hand in the human fashion before he could decide whether to offer it, smiled warmly, and said in flawless Conclave standard, "Thank you for receiving me. I apologize for the short notice. We've been meaning to come by for a while." A while, 47 years, a while. Jeseth managed to say, "Welcome to Conclave Station Meridian, Ambassador. We were not aware you were coming." "No," she agreed pleasantly, "you weren't." She looked around the docking bay with genuine curiosity, taking in the ships, the personnel, the damage marks on the far wall from an attack 18 months ago that hadn't fully been repaired yet. Something moved behind her eyes. Not pity exactly, something more complicated. "I'd like to arrange a meeting, both the Vreth Dominion and Selorian Collective, simultaneously." The docking bay went quiet. Even the equipment seemed to stop humming for a moment. "Ambassador," Jeseth said carefully, "those two parties have not been in the same room in a very long time." "I know," she said. "I'd like to fix that. I think they'll come." She paused, and something in her voice shifted just slightly, just enough. "Tell them the human ambassador requests their presence. I don't think you'll need to ask twice." She was right. The invitations went out. Both responses came within 6 hours. Neither side explained why they accepted. Neither side seemed entirely comfortable with the fact that they had. Kothval was in the Vreth delegation. She had requested the assignment personally, burning 3 months of accumulated diplomatic favors to get it. She sat in the briefing room 2 hours before the meeting and studied Vasquez's public file, which was almost entirely empty. No military record, no listed position in the human government, just a name, an age range, and a job title, Ambassador Plenipotentiary. full authority to speak and act for all of humanity. They gave one person full authority to speak for their entire species. She thought about what that implied, about how confident you would have to be or how unified to do something like that. The meeting room was a masterpiece of deliberate neutrality. Round table, equal chairs, no flags. The Vreth delegation entered from the left door. The Silurian delegation entered from the right. They did not look at each other. The accumulated hatred in the room was almost a physical presence, dense and ancient and very, very tired. Vasquez entered from the center door. Alone. She sat down, folded her hands on the table, and looked at both delegations with a steady, unhurried gaze. She was the calmest person in the room by an enormous margin. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I'll be brief, because I don't think brevity is something either of your peoples has experienced recently, and I think you deserve some." She let that settle. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I speak for humanity. We have been watching your war for 47 years. We have watched carefully, completely, and without the interference of opinion, just observation and analysis. And I'm here because we've reached a point where our continued silence would itself become a choice. So we've chosen to speak instead." She paused. "I know why your war started. I know every battle, every betrayal, every grievance on both sides. I know what you've lost. I know what you've done. And I know, with a certainty I will demonstrate, where this ends if you let it continue." Drevas, sitting across the table, looked at her with the careful eyes of a predator assessing something unfamiliar. "And where does it end, Ambassador?" Vasquez looked at him calmly. "Badly," she said, "for everyone, including the species neither of you are currently watching." She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds, enough to land, not enough to explain. "I've brought a framework. You have 30 days to read it." She placed 2 data chips on the table. One slid toward each side. Drevas stared at his. "And if we refuse?" Vasquez stood, picked up her small bag, and moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the frame, her back to the room, her voice perfectly even. "Then we stop waiting," she said. She walked out, the door whispered shut behind her. For a long moment, nobody in the room said anything. The Vreth and Silurian delegations sat in the same room, something that hadn't happened in decades, staring at 2 small data chips on a round table. Kothval looked at the chip in front of her. She thought about a 47-year silence, about 43 missing ships, about an energy signature no one could classify, about a woman who had walked into the most dangerous diplomatic room in the galaxy, alone, without guards, and somehow been the only person there who didn't seem worried about what would happen next. She reached out and picked up the chip. Intelligence Officer Sewell had not slept in 4 days. This was not, by Vreth standards, particularly unusual. Vreth biology could sustain consciousness for up to 9 days before mandatory shutdown, a trait that had made them excellent soldiers and, in peacetime, spectacularly dysfunctional at social gatherings. But Sewell's particular sleeplessness had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the file currently open on his screen, which he kept reading, hoping it would somehow become less alarming, and which kept refusing to cooperate. It had started as a routine signals intercept. Standard procedure when a new diplomatic contact was established. You listened to everything, cataloged what you could, and filed the rest for later analysis. Human signals should have been easy. After 47 years of silence, there shouldn't have been much to catch. There was a lot to catch. It wasn't that the communications were unencrypted. They were encrypted heavily in a rotating cipher system that his best analysts had spent 3 days simply describing before giving up on breaking. It was that the sheer volume was staggering. Not messages, signals, infrastructure signals. The kind of low-level electromagnetic noise that large, complex industrial systems radiate the way a fire radiates heat. Unavoidable. Ambient. The acoustic fingerprint of a civilization at work. Sewell had grown up near the great shipyards of Vreth Prime. He knew what industry sounded like. He had spent 30 years cataloging the electromagnetic signatures of every major military installation in the known galaxy. He knew the sound of a forge, a fabrication line, an energy relay, a weapons test. What was coming out of human space sounded like all of those things simultaneously, operating at a scale that made the back of his neck go cold. He had called in 3 separate specialists. Each of them had listened to his analysis, looked at his data, and gone quiet in a way that said, "I hear you, and I don't want to say what I'm thinking out loud." So he said it out loud himself. In the 47 years of silence, humanity had not been hiding. They had not been cowering. They had not been paralyzed by the scale of the galactic war or quietly hoping it would resolve itself. They had been constructing, methodically, continuously, and, most disturbingly, intelligently. Not just building ships, building an architecture, automated manufacturing chains that could replicate themselves. Deep space shipyards tucked into asteroid fields that radar scanned as nothing more than unremarkable rock formations. Energy harvesting structures orbiting their sun that had been, for decades, mistaken by conclave astronomers for a natural ring of orbital debris. Distributed computing networks woven through their entire home system like a nervous system, processing information at speeds that made Vreth military AI look like children doing arithmetic. And the training logs, those were what kept Sewell awake at night. Fragments, just fragments, intercepted and partially decoded, of what could only be described as the most comprehensive military education program ever assembled. They hadn't trained their soldiers in current galactic warfare. They had compiled every recorded conflict in conclave history, every species, every century, every tactical school cross-referenced it, synthesized it, identified patterns no single civilization had ever had the breadth to notice, and built a doctrine from scratch that corresponded to no tradition and no school and nothing Sewell had ever seen. It wasn't the doctrine of a civilization preparing to fight a particular enemy. It was the doctrine of a civilization preparing to end wars, specifically, efficiently, and at a scale of their choosing. He wrote his report. He read it over twice. He considered briefly softening it. Then he didn't, because softening it would have been a disservice to everyone who would need to act on it, and Sewell had survived 40 years of intelligence work by being honest when it was uncomfortable. The report's final line read, "They didn't go silent because they were afraid. They went silent because they were getting ready, and by all available evidence they are ready now." He submitted it at 300 hours station time. By 600, he had been summoned to the office of Admiral Vren. Vren read the report in silence. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked out the viewport at the stars for a long time without saying anything. "How confident are you?" he asked finally. "In the data, completely," Sewell said. "In my interpretation, 94%. He paused. "The remaining 6% accounts for the possibility that it's even larger than I've estimated and I'm missing part of it." Vren closed his eyes briefly. He was old enough to have heard of the Torvin incident when it happened, old enough to have read the real report, not the sanitized one, old enough to have filed it away in the back of his mind in a cabinet labeled things I hope I never have to revisit. "The data chip," he said. "The framework Vasquez left." "Yes, sir." "Get me a full analysis team on it, best people we have. I want to know everything, what it proposes, what it concedes, what it requires of us, and most importantly." He picked up his tea, looked into it, set it down again. "Whether it's designed by people who already know they could simply take what they want and are offering this instead." Sewell stood to leave. "One more thing," Vren said quietly, still looking at the viewport. "The energy signature from Torvin, the one no one could classify," he turned. "Is it in their current emission profile?" Sewell had been hoping he wouldn't ask that. "Yes, sir," he said. "As background radiation, consistent across the entire system." He hesitated. "It's not a weapon signature, sir. I mean, it might be attached to a weapon, but the signature itself is." He searched for the right word. "It's a readiness signature, like a power system that's always warm, always on." He looked at his admiral steadily. "They never turned it off, sir. Not in 47 years. It's been running the entire time." "Waiting." Vren looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once slowly. Go, he said. Quickly. The private meetings happened on neutral ground, a small, deliberately unremarkable station at the edge of the dead zone between the two front lines. The kind of place that existed in the gaps of history, too small to name and too useful to destroy. Vasquez met with the Vreth leadership first, then the Silurian. Then, and this was the part that left both sides quietly unnerved, she met with them together in the same room for the second time in the war's long history. She didn't begin with the framework, she began with the dead. She named battles, dates, casualty figures, not the rounded, sanitized numbers that appeared in official reports, but the precise counts, down to individual ships and crew rosters. She cited Silurian engagements and Vreth engagements with equal weight, equal detail, equal gravity. She spoke about the colony worlds that had been depopulated, the cultures that had been erased, the languages and art forms and histories that existed now only in conclave archives, because everyone who had spoken them was gone. Nobody interrupted her, nobody tried. When she finished, the silence in the room was not the hostile, armored silence of two enemies facing each other. It was something heavier and older. The silence of people being made to see, clearly and without mercy, the full shape of what they had done. I'm not here to assign blame, she said. Both of your peoples have committed atrocities. Both of your peoples have also suffered them. The accounting balances roughly if you're the kind of person who counts that way. She paused. I'm not. She pulled up a holographic display, star maps, fleet positions, resource projections, demographic models. Decades of data, organized and synthesized with a clarity that made several analysts in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats, because it was better than their own internal intelligence. More complete, more accurate, as if someone had been watching the whole war from outside with unhurried attention and perfect memory. This is where you are, she said, walking them through it. This is your current trajectory. These are your resource reserves, both of you, actual numbers, not the ones you report to each other or to yourselves. She highlighted a cluster of systems on the far edge of the galactic rim. And this is what you're not watching. The Rhineth Ascendancy, a civilization beyond the rim that both sides had categorized as a minor, developing power and promptly forgotten about while consumed by their own war. The holographic display showed their growth curve over the last 40 years. It was, to put it plainly, terrifying. While the Vreth and Silurian had been bleeding each other white, the Rhineth had been expanding, industrializing, and, according to Vasquez's data, specifically studying the war between the two great powers with the focused attention of someone learning exactly how to defeat them both. You have perhaps 12 years, Vasquez said, before they are positioned to move. By that point, current projections suggest the Vreth Dominion will have lost approximately 60% of its pre-war fleet capacity. The Silurian Collective will have lost 73%. Neither of you will be in any position to resist an external force of this magnitude. Not alone, possibly not together. She let that sit. There will be no glorious last stand. There will be no heroic resistance. There will be a very efficient conquest of two exhausted, gutted civilizations by a third party that studied your mistakes for 4 decades and has no intention of repeating them. Drevas spoke for the first time. His voice was flat, controlled. You've known about this for how long? We identified the Rhineth growth pattern 31 years ago, Vasquez said. The room absorbed that. 31 years, while the war continued, while both sides bled. Humanity had known for 31 years and said nothing, done nothing, simply watched and recorded and refined their models. Why didn't you warn us? The question came from the Vreth High Counselor, and it wasn't angry. It was genuinely bewildered, the voice of someone trying to understand the rules of a game they hadn't known they were playing. Vasquez looked at him with an expression that was not unkind. Because 31 years ago, neither of you would have listened, and warning you without being believed would only have told the Rhineth that we were watching them. She folded her hands. So we waited. We refined our analysis. We built a solution. And we waited until the moment when the evidence would be undeniable, when the exhaustion on both sides would make the idea of peace feel less like surrender and more like survival. She slid the data chips, the framework chips, to the center of the table. 40 years of work, she said quietly. Every concession, every compromise, every border adjustment, every resource-sharing agreement modeled, tested, revised, tested again. We ran 200,000 simulations. She looked at both leaderships in turn. It works. It's not perfect. You'll each feel like you've given up too much, but it works, and it gives you a fighting chance against what's coming. Drevos looked at his chip. Then he looked up at her with the eyes of someone who has spent 40 years believing that power was the only language that mattered, and is confronting, for the first time, the possibility that patience might be something else entirely. And what does humanity get out of this? A galaxy worth living in, she said simply. She stood to leave. She always seemed to leave before anyone could think of the right question. But this time, Kothful, sitting quietly in the back as a junior Vreth observer, spoke up. Ambassador. Her voice was steadier than she expected. The 2 Cellorian ships that disappeared near your space 3 weeks ago, the Scouts. Vasquez paused, turned slightly. They're fine, she said. Their crews are being hosted comfortably. We wiped their sensor logs. I hope you'll understand why, and will return them within the week. A pause. We didn't hurt anyone. We never do when we don't have to. She looked at Kothful directly for a moment, really looked at her, with the kind of attention that felt like being precisely and completely seen. Good question, she added softly. Then she left. The data chip was the size of a human thumbnail. Drevos sat alone in his war room at 3 in the morning on the 14th day, turning it over and over between his fingers, and thought about how strange it was that something so small could contain 40 years of someone else's, thinking about a problem he had lived inside for his entire adult life. He had read it twice now. His analysts had torn it apart and put it back together and torn it apart again. They had looked for traps, hidden clauses, advantageous ambiguities, the fine print where humanity helped itself to something the Cellorian collective would regret conceding. They had found nothing, or rather, they had found something far more unsettling than a trap. They had found a document that was genuinely, rigorously fair. Not fair in the way that things are fair when nobody's happy. Fair in the deeper sense, fair in the way a good surgeon is fair to a wound, addressing what's actually there rather than what you wish were there. Every concession the Cellorian collective was asked to make was paired with a corresponding Vreth concession of equivalent weight. Every border adjustment was supported by 300 years of demographic data. Every resource-sharing agreement was modeled on economic frameworks drawn from 12 different species and tested across 200,000 simulations. It was, frankly, better than anything his own strategic planning division had produced in 40 years of trying, and his strategic planning division was the best in the collective. He thought about the Rhineth ascendancy. His own intelligence service had the Rhineth flagged as a medium priority developing power. He had, upon receiving Vasquez's data, immediately ordered a full reassessment. The results had come back in 72 hours. His chief analyst had delivered them in person, which she only did when the news was too significant to commit to a written report. The numbers matched humanity's projections almost exactly. 12 years, possibly less. Drevos set the chip down on the table and looked at the war map that covered the wall of his command room, a map he had stared at every day for decades, watching the lines shift millimeter by millimeter, measuring the war's progress in light years and millions of dead. He tried to remember when it had started to feel less like a campaign and more like a condition, like weather, like something that simply was and would always be and could not be argued with. He picked up a different file, the one his intelligence division had quietly compiled on human military capacity, the one that had started as a risk assessment and had slowly, over 3 days of analysis, become something his senior staff were reluctant to show him and more reluctant to discuss. The numbers were extraordinary, not just in scale, though the scale was extraordinary, but in design. Human military doctrine didn't look like anything else in the galaxy. It had been built from scratch, drawing on every recorded conflict in conclave history, but synthesized into something new. It didn't optimize for winning battles. It optimized for terminating conflicts. The difference, his analysts had explained in careful, quiet voices, was the difference between a sword and a scalpel. One you used to fight, the other you used when you needed something to end. Somewhere across the neutral zone, in a sleepless office very much like this one, the Vreth High Counselor was presumably reading the same framework and confronting the same arithmetic. The thought didn't bring Drevos comfort. It brought him something stranger, a faint, unfamiliar sense of company. Two old enemies sitting in the dark on either side of a decision, each alone and each, perhaps, thinking the same thing. On the 22nd day, something unprecedented happened. A junior Silurian fleet admiral, young, decorated from a family that had been fighting this war for 4 generations, submitted a public statement through the Conclave newswire calling for a ceasefire review. She cited Vasquez's data on the Rhinoth ascendancy. Within 6 hours, the statement had been shared across 17 star systems. Within 24, 14 other officers, Silurian and Vreth both, had publicly endorsed it. Drevos's communications officer reported this to him, with the nervous energy of someone expecting the order to suppress it. Drevos looked at the report for a long time. He did not give the order. On the 30th day, the last day, Kothful sat in her quarters on Conclave Station Meridian and reread the framework for the 6th time. She had come to it the way she came to everything, systematically, skeptically, determined not to be moved by hope because hope was a thing that got you killed in wartime. She was moved anyway. Not by the politics of it, not by the elegant engineering of the concessions, by something smaller, a section near the end, almost a footnote titled Cultural Reconciliation Protocols. It outlined in careful detail a process by which both species would commission joint historical records, not propaganda, not Victor's history, but a genuine shared account of the war, written by historians from both sides and cross-referenced for accuracy. A record of what had happened and why, and what it had cost. It was 40 years of work, she thought again, and somewhere in those 40 years, a human had thought to include this, had thought about the people who would come after, who would need to understand, who would need to be given permission to stop hatting. She set the pad down and looked at the ceiling. On the other side of the station, she knew, a Silurian delegation was reading the same document. She tried to imagine Drevos reading the Cultural Reconciliation section and failed entirely. But then again, she thought, she had failed to imagine a lot of things in the last 30 days. Failed to imagine both leaderships agreeing to meet. Failed to imagine Vasquez walking into that room alone and walking out having changed the temperature of the whole galaxy. Failed to imagine a species spending 47 years in silence and emerging with something that looked, against all probability, like wisdom. Her comm chimed. It was Admiral Vryn. "The counselor wants your read," he said. "Final recommendation." She looked at the datapad. She thought about 17,000 dead on a convoy she had watched limp into dock. She thought about an energy signature that had been running, warm and ready and patient, for 47 years. "Sign it," she said. The signing ceremony was not grand. There were no banners, no speeches prepared months in advance, no ceremonial swords or ancient seals or the theatrical grandeur that both the Vreth Dominion and Silurian Collective typically deployed when they wanted history to remember them well. There was a table, there were chairs, there were 2 documents and 2 pens, and there were a great many people in that room who looked like they hadn't slept properly in weeks, because they hadn't. The High Counselor of the Vreth Dominion signed first. His hand was steady. His face was unreadable. He set the pen down and did not look at the Silurian delegation. War Marshal Drevos signed second. He sat for a moment after his signature was down, looking at it, at his own name in his own hand on a peace agreement, as if he was trying to recognize himself in it. Then he set the pen down, and he did not look at the Vreth delegation, and for a moment the 2 most powerful military figures in the known galaxy simply sat in silence on opposite sides of a table, each alone with the weight of what they had just done. Nobody cheered. It didn't feel like a moment for cheering. It felt like the moment after a very long storm, when the rain has finally stopped and everything is quiet and wet, and you can't quite believe yet that it's over. Vasquez witnessed the signing but did not speak during it. She stood to the side, characteristically to the side, Kothful thought, watching from her own position near the back wall, and observed with an expression that was calm and attentive and carried, underneath both of those things, something that might have been relief. The profound, exhausted relief of someone who has been holding their breath for a very long time. 3 days later, the full conclave convened in formal session for the first time in decades with representatives from every member species present, including, at the head table, a human delegation of 7 people, of whom Vasquez was one. 7 people to speak for a civilization that had spent nearly half a century in deliberate silence, and the room was so quiet when they walked in that you could hear the ventilation systems. Vasquez stood to address the conclave. She was not a dramatic speaker. She didn't have the booming cadence of a military address or the calculated warmth of a career politician. She spoke the way she did everything, directly, clearly, without waste. She began with acknowledgement. Every species in the room had lost something in the war. She named them all, not in the sweeping, gestural way of someone performing grief, but precisely, specific worlds, specific communities, specific things that no longer existed. She let each loss be real for a moment in the room. Then she said, "Humanity has a complicated history. You know some of it. We were not always patient. We were not always wise. We fought our own wars, long, terrible wars, and we made every mistake that can be made, and we paid for each one. And slowly, across many generations, we learned something." She paused. "We learned that the most powerful thing a civilization can do is not to strike first, or strike hardest, or strike most precisely, though all of those things have their place. The most powerful thing a civilization can do is choose the moment it acts. And to choose well, you have to be willing to wait and watch and understand, and resist the tremendous temptation to move before the moment is right." She looked around the room at the Vreth, the Silurian, the dozens of other species who had been caught in the war's gravity for generations. "We waited 47 years. Some of you might feel that we waited too long, that we could have intervened earlier, saved more lives. You may be right. We ran those models too. The costs of earlier intervention, the risk of becoming simply another faction in a conflict without end, the danger of making something worse that we did not yet fully understand." She paused. "We made a judgment. History will tell us if we judged correctly. What I can tell you is that we made it carefully and we meant well, and we are here now." She sat down. The conclave voted, 1 hour later, to create a new diplomatic category. Not an empire, not an alliance, not a protectorate. A new category created specifically for humanity, without precedent in conclave history. The formal designation in conclave records was long and official and bureaucratic. But in the corridors and the comm channels and the news feeds that blazed across 100 star systems that night, the translation that stuck was simpler. The one that spread and repeated and became the thing that history would remember. The patient ones. Kothful found out in the middle of the night, her comm unit buzzing with the newswire. She sat up in her bunk, read the headline, and laughed. A short, genuine, slightly overwhelmed sound that she hadn't planned and couldn't have stopped. She pressed her hand over her mouth and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the first day she had found that untouched circle on the star chart. The little blue-green world sitting quiet while everything around it burned. The words of a message sent 47 years ago that had lodged in her mind like a splinter and never left. At this time. She dressed and went to the observation deck. The first human fleet entered conclave space at 600 hours station time, precisely as scheduled. Kothful stood at the viewport and watched them come. She had reviewed the intelligence briefings. She had known, intellectually, what to expect. It was still something else entirely to see it. The ships moved with a quiet, unhurried confidence that was nothing like the aggressive formations of a military fleet and nothing like the scattered pattern of a merchant convoy. They moved like something that knew exactly where it was going and had arranged, a long time ago, never to be in a hurry about it. They were beautiful in the way that things built with enormous care and absolute purpose tend to be beautiful. Clean lines, efficient forms, no wasted gesture. There were more of them than the intelligence briefings had suggested. Not dramatically more, just enough more that you understood, looking at it, that the briefings had been working from incomplete data, and that the incompleteness had been intentional, and that humanity had chosen to let the conclave discover the full picture only now, only here, only once the peace was signed and the moment was right. Kothvil stood at the viewport and watched them come, and thought about 47 years of silence that hadn't been silence at all, had been building, planning, watching, learning, preparing, refining, waiting. And she felt something move through her that she didn't have a precise word for. It was adjacent to awe, and adjacent to relief, and adjacent to the very specific emotion you feel when something you feared turns out to be, against all odds, on your side. Somewhere behind her, a young staff officer let out a long, slow breath. "There are a lot of them," he said quietly. "Yes," Kothvil said. "Were they always that many?" She smiled, still watching the ships come in, calm and steady and patient and real, filling the viewport like a slow sunrise. "Yes," she said, "they were always that many." She paused. "They were just waiting for the right moment to show up." Outside, the stars burned as they always had, ancient and cold and indifferent. But the war was over, and the patient ones had finally, after a very long wait, decided the moment had come. They had been right. They did not come as conquerors. They did not come as saviors. They came as something the galaxy had never quite seen before, a people who had learned, through fire and failure and the long discipline of time, the rarest skill in the universe, knowing when to act and having the strength to wait until then.